Ever notice how something can start out with, one clear intention, one core idea,
Uh-huh.
and then slowly, bit by bit, it just kind of morphs into something else, almost without anyone noticing?
Yeah, like a tool made for one thing, but then it gets used for everything else, and you forget the original point.
Exactly. So today, we're sort of applying that idea to something huge,
Mm,
the essence of Christianity itself.
right. We're diving into Jacques Ellul's work, specifically his book, The Subversion of Christianity.
A pretty provocative title.
Definitely. Ellul really challenges us, asking if Christianity, as we often see it now, is, well, a major shift from what Jesus and his first followers were about.
Yeah, it's not exactly light reading. He pushes you to question things, look really critically at how Christian thought and practice developed over history.
Hmm.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack that central idea. How did this subversion, as he puts it, actually happen? What forces were involved?
And what does this critical view offer you, the listener, in understanding a faith that's shaped so much?
Right. So let's start where Ellul starts this fundamental idea of practice.
Yes, the absolute priority of, like, lived faith. Ellul points straight to that image Jesus uses, end of the Sermon on the Mount.
Building your house on the rock versus the sand.
Exactly. Now, the common reading is, well, Jesus is the rock.
Sure, so that makes sense.
But Ellul digs a bit deeper. He emphasizes what Jesus actually says.
Okay.
Jesus says the one who hears his words and does them, that's the person building on rock. Hear but don't act. Sand.
Ah, so it's not just acknowledging Jesus.
It's the doing.
Hmm.
The active living out of the teaching. That's the bedrock for Ellul. The proof, the reality of faith, is in the practice.
Wow, that really shifts the perspective. Faith as something you do, not just believe in your head.
It's fundamental. And he points out that even Paul, the theologian of grace,
Right, you might think Paul would focus elsewhere.
but Paul constantly pushes believers to live in a way that reflects that grace. Luke's gospel says the same true hearers put it into practice. Faith isn't passive acceptance, it's active engagement.
So this doing, this active living, is the starting point. But then Ellul critiques the very term Christianity.
Yeah, this is crucial, the irrealism on the end.
Well, what's the issue with Ellul's?
Ellul argues it signals a shift. It turns a living thought, a way of life, into an ideology, a doctrine, maybe even a system based on a certain philosophical take.
Like it codifies it, freezes it.
Precisely. He mentions Marx and Kierkegaard, how they hated their ideas being turned into rigid Marxism or whatever. They felt it killed the dynamic aspect.
It's like trying to capture a river in a bucket. You lose the flow.
That's a great analogy. Ellul sees this huge gap opening up between that initial rock of lived faith and what he called the sandy wastes of these later formalized Illinisms.
And he admits this happens elsewhere, right? Thomism, Lutheranism.
Oh yeah, it's not unique. People build systems based on thinkers. Aquinas, Luther, Calvin. You get Thomism, Lutheranism, Calvinism.
But he thinks with Christianity, the shift is somehow bigger, more profound.
Exactly. He argues the sheer scale and nature of the original revelation make this drift into an Ellimism especially significant, maybe even more obscuring than in other cases.
Okay, so practice gets overshadowed by the legalism, then he tackles morality. How does that get subverted? This sounds like another challenge to common ideas.
It really is. Ellul says true liberty isn't just, humans deciding stuff for themselves.
Yeah.
He calls it the permanent action of God. Right away, that separates his view from purely philosophical or sociological ethics, which focus on human reason or social norms.
So morality is tied to what God is actively doing.
That's the idea. And he goes back to Genesis, to Adam and Eve and the knowledge of good and evil.
What's his angle there?
He doesn't think they suddenly knew some universal moral code. He thinks they gained the ability to declare what's good and bad.
Like God does.
Sort of, yeah. But crucially, without God's perspective or guarantee. So for Ellul, humans trying to set up their own moral systems is, inherently flawed from the start.
Whoa. So the Old Testament commandments, Paul's instructions, they aren't meant as a fixed ethical code in the way we often think.
Less a code, more like signposts. Frontiers of life and death, he calls them. Examples to guide personal choices made in obedience to God.
And he points to Jesus seemingly breaking rules.
Right, and Paul questioning the absolute need for the old law. Ellul sees this as proof they weren't just swapping one legal system for another. It was about a different kind of freedom, a different relationship.
Definitely a challenging way to read those texts. Okay, so let's shift to how Christianity interacted with other cultures. Absorption, reorientation.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Elul talks about reorientation. It's almost like, taking existing cultural stuff, texts, ideas, and giving them a totally new spin through the lens of faith.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about that Egyptian poem that shows up in the book of Job. Its original meaning gets completely reoriented within the Israelite understanding of God.
Ah,
Or Genesis Elul sees the creation stories as directly challenging the Babylonian myths that were dominant then.
so using the culture's own language to say something different.
Exactly. Even taking bits of Stoic philosophy, which was big in the Greco-Roman world, and fitting it into a Christian framework of sin, redemption, resurrection. The words might seem similar, but the meaning is flipped.
And it wasn't always serious philosophy, was it? He mentioned humor.
Oh, yeah. The Hebrews apparently loved using wordplay to kind of mock their neighbors' gods, turning the god Baal's name into Beelzebub.
Lord of the Flies.
Exactly. Pretty clear ridicule. So they engaged culture, but often twisted it.
But Elul also talks about a different kind of absorption where Christianity maybe adapts too much.
Yes, that's the other side. He sees this trend throughout history. Christianity blending with Greco-Roman ways, then feudal structures, then bourgeois values, now maybe socialist ideas or African, Asian traditions.
The whole all things to all men idea.
Alou worries that sometimes becomes just mimicry, constantly changing shape to fit in, maybe losing its own distinct edge in the process.
This leads us to a really key point in his argument. The big shift from seeing Revelation as history to seeing it as philosophy.
Yes, for Alou, this is a massive turning point where things start to go off track. He argues that many major theologians, Irenaeus, Augustine, Aquinas, even Luther and Calvin,
Big names.
huge names, he thinks they made a critical error by prioritizing philosophical frameworks metaphysics over understanding God's revelation as it unfolds in actual historical events.
So they started with philosophical questions and then looked to the Bible for answers instead of letting the Bible's story shape the questions.
That's exactly his point. They came with their existing intellectual toolkit, their questions about reality and knowledge, and sort of used biblical texts to build philosophical systems.
Yeah.
Ellul insists God reveals himself in history, through interactions, through events.
Not through abstract ideas or timeless moral laws.
Right. He stresses that the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it's basically a collection of stories about God's relationship with people. It's not a philosophical treatise.
Even the laws given to Israel were tied to that specific history.
Absolutely. For Elul, the law is true and binding because God spoke it in that specific covenant relationship at that time, not because it reflects some universal abstract moral principle detached from history.
And this shift towards philosophy then opened the door for ideas like the immortal soul from Greek thought.
Yes, and this is another area where Elul sees a major deviation. Because the original Jewish understanding, Paul's understanding,
Was different.
radically different. In that view, death is total. There's no little bit, no immortal soul that naturally survives. The hope isn't inherent survival, it's resurrection. God making things new.
Whereas Greek philosophy had this idea of a soul separate from the body, naturally immortal.
Exactly. And Elul argues that when that idea got absorbed into Christian thinking, it was a profound distortion. It shifted the focus from God's grace and the future resurrection towards evaluating people based on their virtues, their works in this life, because their immortal soul was supposedly guaranteed anyway. It changed the whole understanding of salvation, destiny.
He even brings in Pythagorean astronomy, souls exiled on Earth.
Yeah, just to show how deeply these outside philosophical ideas seeped in and reshaped theology. And this, Elul says, affected how people understood conversion.
How did conversion get diluted?
It became increasingly about just adopting the right beliefs and behaviors, moral adherence, joining the religious group.
Without that deeper change in thinking.
Potentially, yes. Elul contrasts this with Jesus saying, love God with all your mind. How do you do that, he asks, if you're trying to force faith into neat, objective, philosophical boxes? It doesn't quite fit.
He talks about the Bible having a vital incoherence, right? Like life itself.
Yes. It reflects the messiness, the paradoxes of real faith and life. It's not a tidy system. Trying to make it one smooths over important tensions loses the vitality.
Okay, another huge factor Ella points to is, well, success. The very success and institutionalization of Christianity.
That's a classic story, isn't it? A movement grows, gets organized, and the organization itself starts to change the movement.
How did early growth happen?
Well, the Jewish diaspora helped existing networks. Plus, there was a real spiritual hunger in the Roman Empire. old pagan beliefs were fading. The Christian message offered hope.
And initially it appealed more to the marginalized, poor people, slaves.
Yes, but as it spread, it attracted intellectuals, the wealthy, the elite. And with them came resources, influence, money.
And that changed things.
Ellul argues it did. Wealth accumulation, he says, led to early practices like sharing goods disappearing, managing bigger groups, more money. It inevitably led to formal structures, bishops, hierarchies.
Which started looking like the Roman Empire's own structures.
Consciously or not, yeah. The very act of getting organized, managing success, brought in these external ways of doing things that maybe didn't fit the original spirit.
And this connects to a shift from grace to works.
Ellul thinks so. As the church got wealthier, it could do more good works, more charity, which is great, but the emphasis shifted. These works started being seen not just as expressions of grace-driven change, but maybe as proof of it, or even ways to earn favor.
And things like canonizing saints, focusing on amazing feats.
Yeah, that could reinforce the idea that some people achieve righteousness through extraordinary actions, potentially overshadowing the idea that everyone needs grace equally.
So it moves away from Jesus to challenge what more are you doing, being about radical love.
Towards just meeting a kind of expected standard of religious behavior, obeying the laws of nature, becoming respectable, rather than relying on the disruptive power of grace.
And this shift, Ellul says, also connects to the marginalization of women. That's a striking connection.
It is. He suggests that women perhaps embodied some of those core, maybe softer elements of early Christianity. Grace, love, charity, nonviolence.
Things that got sidelined.
Things he believes Christianity started setting aside as it chased worldly power, success, glory. It wasn't just about specific Bible verses used later, though he acknowledges that happened.
So not primarily about interpreting Paul this way or that.
He thinks the deeper issue was adopting the values of the surrounding society. Conquest, power, domination values that historically often excluded women. As the church adopted these values,
Women got pushed out of leadership, out of the conversation.
that's his argument. And then biblical texts get pulled out of context to justify it. He even suggests the growing wealth directed the church away from those feminine values.
He also notes it coincided with stricter moral codes for women and interprets the rise of the cult of the Virgin Mary in a specific way.
Yeah, quite provocatively. He suggests that elevating Mary to this incredibly high, almost unattainable standard of purity.
Seemed like honoring women, but
And maybe it served as an ideological cover.
Yeah.
It set up this perfect ideal that other, real women couldn't possibly meet, reinforcing the need for control.
wow. Then there's Kierkegaard's point about numbers. Christianity having an inverse relation to numbers. That sounds odd.
It's counterintuitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kierkegaard said the state needs numbers, fewer people weakens it. But Christianity, its reality is in the individual. One truly committed Christian gives it reality.
So when everyone becomes Christian,
The concept gets diluted. If everyone in society is nominally Christian, where's the tension? Where's the distinctiveness, the challenge to the world? It can become just culture.
Christendom, aiming to make everyone Christian, could actually abolish real Christianity.
That's the startling idea. It highlights the difference between deep personal faith and just, cultural conformity.
Right.
And this can lead to losing that glorious freedom in Christ.
Replaced by rules and commandments.
Exactly. Ellul notes even in the early church, like in Corinth, Paul had to deal with people misusing freedom.
It wasn't licensed to do anything.
No, it demands self-control, wisdom, connection with God, love. Ellul calls it a superhuman risk. It's demanding.
Maybe too demanding. Intolerable.
That's what he suggests. It's easier to analyze it, reduce it, make rules around it, or just quietly ignore the radical parts. And later attempts to talk about freedom often use Greek or Roman ideas, losing the biblical sense.
This desire for neatness also leads to simplifying complex theology.
Yeah, like the whole God's power versus human free will debate, often framed as either, when maybe it's a mystery, a both hand.
Or using overly familiar terms for God.
Right. Good Lord, little Jesus.
Yeah.
It can make God seem cozy, maybe, but it risks losing the sense of the divine, the awesome, reducing Jesus to just a nice guy or a moral teacher.
The Western mind wants clarity, logic.
Which doesn't always fit well with the nature of revelation, which isn't always linear or systematic. This desire for unity also played out in missions in syncretism.
Different motivations for missions.
Ellul sees some genuinely focused on saving individuals, but also an ambition, maybe among leaders, for global unity through Christianizing everyone.
And when that didn't work easily.
Syncretism became an option. Blending Christianity with whatever culture or religion it encountered. Greek philosophy, local legends, Buddhism, Marxism.
Ellul sees this as a bad move.
Deeply skeptical. He sees it as compromising the core message, introducing falsehoods, leading Christianity further from its source just to achieve a kind of superficial unity. He links it to the Prince of Lies.
And all this subversion, Ellul argues, might even contribute to nihilism. That feels like a leap.
It's a strong claim. He thinks the way Christianity got twisted inadvertently helped create the conditions for nihilism, that sense of meaninglessness, no absolute values. He differs from those who thought Christianity just built a powerful system.
What specific themes does he claim?
Three main ones. First, emphasizing God's absolute transcendence, making God so other that human life and values seem worthless by comparison.
Second.
Desacralization, stripping the sacred out of the world, which started in Hebrew thought but maybe went too far. If you remove the sacred and don't replace it with a strong sense of God's presence, you get emptiness.
And third, sin.
Yeah, the traditional emphasis on human wickedness, total depravity. If that's hammered home too hard, without an equally strong emphasis on grace and transformation, it can lead to deep pessimism about humanity, bordering on nihilism.
He also insists God's revelation isn't meant to be a perfect logical system.
Exactly. God reveals through relationship, through life, not neat propositions. Trying to force it, like turning sin into an abstract category instead of understanding it through grace, distorts it.
Which means revelation is hard to organize, to institutionalize?
Inherently so. The Holy Spirit is unpredictable. The church isn't a fixed building or hierarchy. It's the people God calls. God's order is always new, not just repeating formulas.
So a faithful church should be fluid, creative.
Mobile, adventurous, not static. But that clashes with our human need for stability, certainty, ownership.
Even in spiritual things.
Especially. Grace disrupts our desire to control, to possess, even our relationship with God. He even brings in psychoanalysis, how messy father-son dynamics challenge simple God the Father images. Revelation should transform our broken relationships, not just adopt them.
And the human drive for power? Violence.
That's universal, not just Western. Revelation offers a radical alternative, power through relationship with God, not domination. But Ellul says the gospel is just, hard.
Intolerable, even.
Its demands for letting go, trusting God, taking a path without guarantees. It rubs against our nature.
He even floats the idea of non-human forces involved. Minions and powers.
Yeah, not like a dualistic evil God, but spiritual forces opposing God's work. Targeting believers, the church, trying to stop God's love being effective. Not necessarily aiming for hell, but making earth hellish by messing up relationships with God and others. He sees the devil's hand behind the subversion.
And connects this to the prince of this world.
Right. He reads those passages about God's seeming absence and the devil offering earthly kingdoms to mean that all current earthly power structures belong to this prince. Not that God made them and they got corrupted, but they are inherently part of that fallen domain.
And the Prince of Lies distorts truth.
Turning truth into fixed dogmas, reality into mere appearance. Lying about God, making him seem like an ogre or just sentimental. Referring Jesus back to the church, leading to claims of exclusive salvation only through the institution.
He also mentions the abomination of desolation. What's that about?
He speculates it could mean the way Christianity maybe devastated older beliefs, leaving a spiritual wasteland when its own truth got undermined. Or maybe it means profound despair within the church itself.
It sounds pretty bleak overall.
It does paint a critical picture. But then comes the turn. E per si morva?
Nevertheless, it moves, Galileo's alleged phrase.
Exactly. Despite all the subversion, Oli insists Christ is still present, the Holy Spirit still acts, the church is constantly being reborn. He rejects being overly cynical or overly apologetic about church history.
There are limits to decay.
Yes, death doesn't have the final word, not for people, not for the church. Think Job, think Revelation. A remnant of truth always survives. God stays faithful.
And renewal happens, often from unexpected places.
Often outside the main structures focused on the world society, politics. He mentions the Polish Solidarity movement under Cardinal Wyszynski as a modern example. Spiritual revival, rooted in tradition, but non-violent, strategic world engaging.
Transformation from the fringes, not the top.
Often, yes. Oli believes nothing is ever finally lost. Christianity, the institution, never decisively defeats Christ. The kingdom's logic keeps breaking in, challenging worldly logic.
Even the problematic institutionalization can paradoxically spark renewal.
Yes. Even that transgression can lead to a new breaking forth, a reconquest of the eternal from within.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into Elilo's Subversion of Christianity. We've really traced his argument about how the original, maybe radical core of Christian teaching got changed over time.
Yeah, altered by so many forces. The shift from practice to doctrine, the whole Engiism thing, morality changing, absorbing culture, philosophy taking over from history, institutional pressures, power.
There's this constant tension he describes between the original gospel, which was often difficult, challenging, and how it got adapted, sometimes smoothed out as it moved through history.
Definitely. And Ilya's challenge really is for you, the listener, to think about how these same forces might still be playing out today.
Not just in churches, but in wider culture, our values.
Absolutely. So the final thought maybe is, what would an unsubverted version of that original message look like now? And what difference would that make to how you understand things, how you engage with the world?
Something to definitely reflect on.